accommodation-wise, you relied primarily on couchsurfing. Is it couchsurfing.com?
It's couchsurfing. Actually, you know what? I can't tell you. I just have it bookmarked. It could be .org or .com. It's couchsurfing. It's the only one that leads to anything.
Is that a millennial base?
That is. I think the founder is like 27. He's from I think North Conway, New Hampshire. So it's the only social networking site out of New Hampshire, I think.
So another innovative
to
model which enables you to contact people. And
to be completely honest, my experience with couchsurfing wasn't stellar, and it was a lot of misconnections with people. Some people who said it would be cool to be in touch with them and like didn't call back, and then it got to a point where I just stopped relying on couchsurfing and started relying on Twitter networks and people who I knew through Facebook. I have from various conferences and different work I do, I have I think like 1,200 Facebook contacts, so that was really helpful as far as getting in touch with people. I've had good experiences with couchsurfing in the past, like individual experiences, but when it came to I needed to get from point A to point B at a particular time, I started to have to rely on a different, less flexible network, or more flexible, less flexible. No. Flexible on my own terms. No. There are people I've been trying to get to Washington D.C. and I've missed it 3 times already on my schedule. And there are people who I met at a conference 3 years ago who are letting me stay at their place, and I feel bad because now I'm on the other end. But it's worked out. It's worked out nicely.
So in your tour, what was your reception like? Not only what did people have to say, but did they seem excited and interested in participating?
Yeah, people seem really excited about this. There's this. I think the millennial generation is the first generation that has their own say in what they are, in a holistic and organic way. And I say that because, the way that Gen X was treated is it was really treated as if it was like, this is Generation X and we're going to talk about, we being people 10 to 20 years older are going to talk about what they are and why it's significant. And it was largely a generation that got defined by the outside. And the millennial generation has an interesting access that they didn't have, that Gen X ultimately created for the millennials to have through the internet boom ultimately, and Gen X and the baby boomers created this information infrastructure in which the millennial generation could come along and have a say. So I find that to be fascinating. But people were really excited to talk about what's going on, how they're participating, how they're trailblazing, what's working, what's not working, and it's been interesting like going on a road trip, and having this appear to people to be like a really archaic idea used in sort of a new way. I mean, in May or June when gas prices were like $3.75 or whatever, and they're, for the historical record, they're $2 now, $2.18. I think the idea of the road trip seemed like it was going to be dead in a year, and people responded in a really funny way to that. It was like Jack Kerouac using Twitter instead of drugs.
We may have to quote that. So
I've been working on that for a while.
Okay. So obviously you've already posted put some blog postings up. Yeah. You've put some video up, and that's something you'll be continuing to do. But are there specific stories or inspirational sort of moments that happened that you want to share?
Yeah, I was really touched by the Interfaith Youth Corps in Chicago. I thought that they're sort of an amazing group of people who are using the internet using it. The internet. The way the internet is interesting is that it's a decentralized network that puts the power in a lot of people's hands. And they're one of the first national groups that I've seen fully embrace that and let the internet exist as a tool by which people on different campuses can organize in ways that is meaningful to them. And I just really liked the people who I met at Interfaith Youth Corps. It's just a good organization of people. And similarly, Focus the Nation, which is a climate change focused group based in Portland, Oregon. And again, just a very likable group of 4 very well organized, very well intentioned people who weren't using the internet when they started. For the first year and a half, they just used Excel to manage their their email lists because they just found it to be easier and less clunky. And then built just a really stellar ground game over a year and a half using very traditional organizational methods, and then integrated the internet based on what worked for them by way of a ground game. Which, when you meet a lot of people now who are using online methods for organization, you find people who get lost in the novelty and forget that a large portion of change happens from face-to-face and person-to-person contact, especially with civic engagement, and especially with augmenting social capital in any way. There definitely needs to be an integrated method in which you're having real conversations and you're meeting people face to face and going to dinners and stuff like that. And so they accidentally found the right balance by just not knowing how to use the internet and then integrating it down the road.
Getting back to a point you made a couple minutes ago, how millennials seem to be more involved in telling their own story, maybe shaping a definition of who they are. I myself am Gen X, and so I can, understand the comparison. But how do millennials, maybe the other side of the coin, how do they seem to react to being under the microscope?
Yeah, I think a lot of people just don't know that they're under the microscope. And then I would email people and say, I'm part of this tour, Millennials Changing America. I want to come and find out how you're doing, how you're organizing, and how you're being received, and what it's like to be of this generation. And they'd say, I'd love to do that. That sounds great. What's a millennial? And so people were really into having the conversation, but didn't necessarily know that they were under the microscope. And going back to something I said even before that, the people who I've gotten a lot of support from are market researchers and advertisers and people who, to be very nice about what they do, ultimately just want to sell sneakers to the generation, or widgets in general. And these are the people who are having these conversations, and what was important to me was to interject and say, it's important to talk about the generation, it's important to talk with the generation. Me being a part of the generation, I felt that was important. But it's also important to integrate into that overall conversation a way that we're having a conversation that's not exclusively facilitating a way to sell them products. It needs to also sell them hope, and it needs to sell them ways to be a part of the system in a productive and holistic way.
Well, a recent blog posting of yours I read online basically posed the question if Kurt Cobain is arguably the spokesman or the voice of the generation, the Gen X generation, who is the voice, or is there a voice for Gen Y?
Right.
Which is an interesting question, and I think ties into what we were just talking about. Is there almost a danger in trying to put a generation in a box, trying to define a generation? What do you hope to achieve with that knowledge?
Sure.
Because you're not clearly out just to sell sneakers.
Right. I think that's a great question, and I pose that question not necessarily to be the devil's advocate, but I would probably be the last person to just say Gen X's voice was Kurt Cobain. That question was formulated because I put up a really unofficial, unstructured poll on both Facebook and Twitter that said, if Kurt Cobain is the voice of the previous generation, what's the voice of this generation? And the reason I said Kurt Cobain is because I kept hearing from a lot of people from Gen X this really negative view of the millennial generation being sort of a coddled, like narcissistic, very sort of self-important generation. And my response was ultimately, turning around like, well, who defines you and who defines this generation? And I sort of continued to hear that Kurt Cobain was coming up, and I think that's really meaningful because Kurt Cobain in so many ways was to a very radical extreme, sort of pushing against this false notion that came from the previous this perceived false notion that came from the previous generation. And and I think that in particular shapes the narrative by which the millennial generation feels a pressure. You know, are we too optimistic for our own good? The last generation perceivably made being cynical cool. Seemed like a